They say only a widower can understand the heart of a widow, and that seems about right. Lately, I've had some dealings with the senior manager's wife, Mrs. And then I received a substantial promotion. I'll whisper that secret here in this channel. How are you going to manage working even on weekends? Weekends are meant for rest. But what can I do if the senior manager insists on going? Employees are at the beck and call of their paycheck. If you want a promotion next year, you've got to show loyalty to the company. It'll be good for the baby too to have a father who's doing well. No matter how much you dislike it, if the senior manager says to go, you go. Sorry, just rest at home. I'll call you my heavily pregnant wife, with one hand on her belly and the other supporting her back, came to see me off at the door with a sigh of discontent. I really didn't want to go. Because of the senior manager, I had even bought fishing gear and a jacket. My wife complained that earning money was so hard, not even getting to rest at home and being dragged into her boss's hobby activities. Truth be told, I too wanted to rest at home. But when the boss commands, what choice do I have? The senior manager lives about 30 minutes away from our house. He suggested I pick him up on the way, and I couldn't refuse, so I drove to the senior manager's place. Fishing is his hobby, but apparently Mrs. thinks it's too dangerous for him to go alone. He sweet-talked me into being his companion for the trip. With the promotion review coming up next year, I gritted my teeth and agreed. Baby, Daddy's working hard like this. I'll get that promotion and buy you everything you need. Before dawn, I drove to the senior manager's apartment complex. He greeted me with a grin, and there was a woman I hadn't met before standing beside him. When I got out to say hello, he said, "This is my wife. She's insisted on coming along." Does Mrs. also enjoy fishing? It seems so. Let's get going. The senior manager, normally eager for his fishing trips, got into the car irritated, perhaps because Mrs. insisted on tagging along. The coordinator must be having a hard time, giving up his day off because of our husband. Your wife must be upset, Mrs. said apologetically as we drove. I had heard that Mrs. was about 10 years younger than the senior manager, which would make her about my age. Mrs. Senior manager seemed excited about fishing for the first time in a while. Dressed casually in overalls and sneakers, topping a white cotton tee, she looked almost like she was in her 20s. Her figure was notably curvaceous. We arrived at the fishing spot, set up the tent, and cast our lines. It was a little-known place, not crowded, and the senior manager knew where the fish bit best, leading us deeper in. We were alone, no one else in sight. Now that the lines are cast, let's have a drink and relax. The fish will start biting soon enough. The senior manager, feeling better upon reaching his beloved fishing spot, hurried to start drinking. He was known to enjoy his liquor, and it wasn't rare for him to leave the fishing spot completely inebriated. It was hard to tell if we were here to fish or just drink. Mrs. pulled out some snacks from the cooler, and the three of us sat down to drink. I had to drive, so I just pretended to sip, while the senior manager drank almost entirely by himself. Mrs. took a few sips but didn't drink much, saying she was a lightweight. After polishing off 3 bottles of soju, the senior manager, feeling the alcohol, mumbled he needed to sleep and crawled into the tent. It's not time for the fish to bite yet. I'll take a quick nap and wake up later. Make sure our lines don't drift away. Soon after, the senior manager's snoring could be heard from within the tent, so loud it seemed to shake the tent itself. He was known to sleep through anything once he passed out drunk. Oh dear, why doesn't he just sleep at home if he's going to drink and not be able to handle it? It's always the same pattern. Mrs. muttered, glaring at the tent where the senior manager was sleeping. Then she turned to me. I heard your wife is pregnant. Yes, she's 8 months along. So I guess you're living the bachelor life these days, too, huh, coordinator? Mrs. asked with a nod, turning her gaze to the water, as if weighed down by her thoughts. Senior manager is lucky to have a young and beautiful wife like you. What good is a young wife if he can't appreciate her, Mrs. said with a hint of bitterness in her voice. The atmosphere turned awkward as Mrs. spoke frankly. Why? Has the senior manager been neglecting you at night? He was very attentive during our courtship. Maybe because of the age difference. But as time went on, reality set in. Sometimes I think I should find a boyfriend, she said, the alcohol giving her courage to speak her truth. Mrs. let out a rueful chuckle. Here I am, spilling my guts to the coordinator. I'm sounding like an old gossip. Forget I said anything, please. Don't worry, I replied. There's an old saying that a widower understands the heart of a widow. Mrs. stretched out, patting her armpits. I couldn't help but think how pitiful the senior manager was, indulging in alcohol and sleep. Neglecting a wife as young and attractive as Mrs. If she were my own wife, I'd cherish her all night long. Where's the restroom around here? Mrs. asked. It's quite a walk from here. You might be better off heading into those woods. Guess I have no choice, she said, heading into the forest. Watching her walk away, I became acutely aware of my own physical reaction, especially since it had been months since my pregnant wife and I had been intimate. Suddenly, from the direction Mrs. had gone, a short scream pierced the air. She had tripped over a rock and was bleeding from her calf. I quickly pulled out a handkerchief and dabbed at the blood on her leg. Supporting Mrs., we made our way back to our spot. I took out the first aid kit, disinfected the wound, and applied some ointment. You're bleeding quite a bit, but it looks like the bleeding has stopped. Rest here for a bit. Thank you. I got quite a scare. You're so well prepared, carrying a handkerchief and all. Your wife is lucky to have someone as young, healthy, and considerate as you, Mrs. said with a bright smile. Then she ventured, Can I ask you something? They say men always want something new, is that true? I felt awkward for a moment and couldn't respond. Mrs. looked at me with soft eyes, and our hands found each other. The warmth felt good. In that moment, Mrs. said, I'm sorry. I must have lost my mind for a bit. I'm feeling so strange today. Mrs., should we be honest with each other? I bravely suggested. Please forget about today. Just erase it from your memory, okay, Mrs. said as she pulled her pants back up. Her expression showed pain from the wound. For a moment, I entertained some wolfish thoughts, but knowing the senior manager could wake at any time, I decided not to rush into anything. Sure enough, the senior manager woke up, reeking of soju, and upon hearing his wife had fallen and was bleeding, he hurriedly gathered our things and insisted we head home. Why did you even come if you're just going to fall? Couldn't even fish properly? What's the point? He grumbled. Then he scolded her. Why did you have to follow me? Aren't you even a little sorry for troubling the coordinator? As if anyone ever wants to get hurt, I thought. The senior manager was being incredibly harsh towards someone who was already injured, and it struck me how lonely Mrs. must feel. We packed up and got into the car. Through the rearview mirror, Mrs. face looked utterly dejected. Our eyes met, and I could see profound loneliness in hers. After that incident, I kept thinking about Mrs. this warm hand and how the senior manager was making her feel lonely. Then one day, coordinator, I have a favor to ask. What is it, senior manager? He stopped me as I was about to leave work and handed me an envelope. These are some real estate documents that I need to get to my wife today, but I've just received a notice that I've got to leave immediately. I won't be able to drop them off at home. Could you drop them in our mailbox on your way? I agreed to do so. The senior manager said he was heading to a family home, but it seemed like he was just looking forward to enjoying free drinks, so lost in his drinking that his wife feels neglected. As I drove to the senior manager's house, I debated whether to just drop the documents in the mailbox or deliver them directly. It would be simpler to follow the senior manager's instructions, but I felt I couldn't miss this opportunity. Eventually, I arrived at the senior manager's house and rang the bell. Mrs. answered the door, looking even more innocent without makeup. She hesitated when she saw me, then said with a shy smile, "My husband called. Thank you for bringing this, but you could have just left it in the mailbox, and I would have come down to get it." I replied, "Is your leg okay? Now that I'm here, I should at least say hello to you before I go." Mrs. hesitated, then invited me in. "Would you like to come in for a cup of tea? I didn't bring anything with me, is that okay?" "Why bring anything? I'm totally grateful you did this errand. Please, come in." I entered the senior manager's house. Seeing her in a princess-style home dress in the kitchen made me feel a certain way. I walked up to her and took her hand. "I'm not thirsty. I want to talk to you, Mrs. Come out quickly. Are you doing this because I told you I was lonely that day?" I grasped her hand again, looking at her with earnest eyes. "I haven't been able to sleep properly lately, because I keep thinking of how lonely you looked that day we went fishing." She took my hand quietly and walked to the living room, drawing the curtains closed. Then she turned to me and asked, "Have you been thinking about me a lot?" I nodded at her gaze. With a look of determination, she asked, "Can you really soothe my loneliness?" Approaching her confidently, I assured her, "Yes, I can." "Okay, then I'll confess too. Ever since that day, my mind has been filled with thoughts of you, coordinator." After affirming our feelings, we shared our love. Post our intimate moment, Mrs. started speaking softly. "Do you know why I pushed your hand away that day? We went fishing because I was sure that one day we would meet like this." I whispered in her ear, "Don't worry, I've got the senior manager's schedule well in hand. I'll come to see you often." "You really are amazing. I guess I should stop nagging my husband to come home early," she said, getting up with a laugh. I felt guilty thinking of my wife at home, struggling with her pregnancy, but I was determined to give my best to Mrs. In this moment, we exchanged phone numbers, and I met her again before heading home from work. Mrs. greeted me with a bright smile. We filled in what our spouses couldn't provide, and this went on for a year. And my promotion to manager? Well, that was just the icing on the cake.